Sarah Thompson just gave up her seat on a crowded bus, but the next morning, when she opened her front door, she gasped. Her entire porch was covered with American flags, and dozens of soldiers stood at attention saluting her. But why? What had happened overnight? Comment 5 if you want to hear this extraordinary story. This is Tales of Kindness. I'm so glad you're here, where we celebrate the power of kindness in every moment. If you enjoy this space, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep our community growing. Sarah Thompson had spent decades living a quiet, unnoticed life. A widow of a Marine, she ran a small dry cleaning shop where she pressed uniforms with the same care she once showed her late husband, Sergeant Robert Thompson. She never expected recognition, never sought attention, just lived each day with quiet kindness. So when Captain Wilson asked if she would be open to a small ceremony to honor Robert, she was touched. Nothing extravagant, he had assured her. Just a small gathering with the men who served with him. Sarah nodded, feeling warmth at the thought. Of course. Around 10 o'clock would be perfect. Wilson offered a strange smile, one she couldn't quite decipher. The next morning, Sarah rose early as usual, despite having stayed up later than normal. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, wrapped in her robe, watching the autumn sun rise. The world outside was painted in soft golds and reds, and for the first time in years, she felt a lightness in her chest. Sharing stories of Robert with his fellow soldiers the night before had been unexpectedly healing. At 9:30, she dressed carefully, choosing her best blue dress, the one she usually saved for Easter and Christmas. She applied a touch of lipstick, and at precisely 10, moved to open the front door. What greeted her eyes left her breathless. Her entire front yard, every inch of it, was covered in American flags. Hundreds of them, perfectly arranged in neat rows across the lawn. On the driveway and lining the street stood at least 50 uniformed service members, standing at rigid attention. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as she froze in the doorway, overwhelmed. Captain Wilson stepped forward in full dress uniform. "Mrs. Thompson," he said solemnly, "on behalf of those who served with Sergeant Robert Thompson, we wanted to do this properly." A sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb. To Sarah's astonishment, Senator Collins stepped out, followed by the Secretary of Defense, and then, incredibly, the Vice President of the United States. The entire neighborhood had gathered to witness the spectacle. People Sarah had lived next to for decades but barely spoken to stood in quiet reverence, hands over their hearts. News vans lined the street. When had they arrived? The Secretary of Defense stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd, "we are gathered here today to honor not one American hero, but two." The Vice President turned to Sarah, cameras flashing around them. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, holding out a small box, "your husband's courage saved 3 American soldiers at the cost of his own health. It is my honor to present you with the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart he so selflessly earned." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she clutched the medals to her chest. "And from what I've learned about you," the Vice President continued, "you have carried on his legacy of service in your own quiet way." The mayor of Oak Ridge, a man who had nodded politely at Sarah in church but never truly spoken to her, stepped forward with glistening eyes. "From this day forward," he declared, "November 12th will be known as Robert and Sarah Thompson Day in our town, honoring not just our military heroes, but the families who support them, silently and steadfastly." 50 uniformed service members raised their hands in a crisp salute. "The President sends his regrets that he couldn't be here himself," the Vice President added, "but he asked me to give you this personal letter of thanks for your decades of support to our military personnel." As reporters surged forward asking for comments, Sarah took a deep breath and found her voice. "The honor belongs to Robert," she said firmly, "and to all who serve. I'm just a dry cleaner who believes in saying thank you." Her humble words only endeared her more to the crowd. Within hours, Sarah Thompson, the quiet widow who had spent years pressing uniforms and leaving small notes of encouragement, became a national symbol of the power of gratitude. 5 years later, Sarah Thompson still works at Hudson's Dry Cleaning, now renamed Thompson Service and Cleaners in her late husband's honor. Despite numerous suggestions that she retire, the now 72-year-old widow continues her daily routine with one significant difference. She is no longer invisible. "I don't need to rest," she tells those who ask why she still works. "Every uniform I press has a story, a person behind it. This isn't just a job. It's how I connect with people like Bob." The small dry cleaning shop has become an unofficial gathering place for veterans in the area. They drop off uniforms, yes, but many come simply to share a cup of coffee and conversation with the woman whose story inspired a movement. Sarah teaches her young employees a lesson she's learned through a lifetime of service. It's not medals or recognition that define us, it's the small daily actions. How carefully you fold a shirt, how sincerely you say thank you. Those are the things that truly matter. The walls of the shop now tell a story of their own. Photographs of Robert in his Marine uniform, of Sarah at the White House receiving the Civilian Medal of Merit, of the dozens of service members who have come to pay their respects. But perhaps the most profound change came through the Robert Thompson Silent Hero Scholarship Fund. Using the stipend that accompanied her husband's posthumous medals, Sarah established a scholarship for the children of veterans and essential workers. Each year, she visits schools and military bases, sharing Robert's story and teaching young minds how small actions can create ripples of change throughout a lifetime. "My husband never knew the full impact of his sacrifice," she often says, "and I never knew the impact of my little notes. That's the magic of kindness. You rarely see where it leads." Her story has spread far beyond Oak Ridge. Jessica Thompson, Sarah's niece, was so inspired that she joined the Marines. In a recent letter from overseas, she wrote, "You have no idea, Aunt Sarah, but many of my fellow Marines have heard about Mrs. Thompson of the thank you notes. They say that as long as America has people like you, they'll always have a reason to serve." Many schools now incorporate Sarah's story into their good citizenship and local heroes curriculum. Children across the country learn that heroism isn't just found on battlefields. It's in the quiet, consistent kindness of ordinary people. On her 70th birthday, over 1,000 veterans traveled from across the country to march past her house in a surprise parade. A statue of Sarah and Robert now stands in the town square with the inscription, "The Silent Heroes." Captain Wilson, now Colonel Wilson, named his daughter Sarah. "Every day," he says, "she reminds me of the power of kindness." In a rare interview, Sarah was once asked, "Do you think Bob is looking down and proud of you?" Tears streamed down her weathered face as she smiled. "No, I think he's laughing and saying, 'See, Sarah, I told you so. The small things are what matter most.' And now, I know he was right. A seat on a bus, a simple note, a warm embrace. Sometimes that's all it takes to change someone's world." Sarah Thompson's story reminds us that no act of kindness is too small to change a life. A surrendered seat, a sincere thank you, a simple gesture of gratitude. These ordinary moments can become extraordinary miracles in someone else's story. In a world where we often think only grand gestures matter, Sarah shows us that true heroes work in the quiet spaces of everyday life. If you believe silent heroes like Sarah Thompson deserve recognition, hit the subscribe button. Each week, we bring you true stories about real kindness, ordinary people doing extraordinary things without fanfare or spotlight. And try performing one small act of kindness today. You never know how it might transform someone's life, or even your own. Remember Sarah's words? No act of kindness is too small to change a life. The years passed, but Sarah Thompson's story never faded. Her small acts of kindness had grown into something far greater than she ever imagined. Though she continued pressing uniforms and offering words of encouragement at Thompson Service and Cleaners, time eventually caught up with her. At the age of 78, Sarah quietly passed away in her sleep, surrounded by the very people whose lives she had touched. Her funeral was unlike anything Oak Ridge had ever seen. Thousands of veterans, military families, and ordinary citizens gathered to pay their respects. The streets were lined with American flags, and at precisely noon, a military honor guard performed a 21-gun salute in her memory. Among the mourners was Colonel Wilson, who now had a young daughter named Sarah, named after the woman who had changed his life. As the funeral procession made its way to the cemetery, a moment of silence was observed across military bases in the country. Even those who had never met her had heard of Mrs. Thompson and her thank-you notes. Though Sarah was gone, her legacy continued to inspire. The Robert and Sarah Thompson Silent Hero Scholarship had already changed hundreds of lives, helping children of veterans and essential service workers pursue their dreams. But what happened 5 years after her passing proved that her influence was far from over. One day, a young Marine named Sergeant Daniel Carter stood before a crowded auditorium at a military academy. His voice was steady, but his eyes glistened with emotion. "When I was 10 years old, my father was deployed overseas. We struggled to get by. One day, my mom went to Thompson Service and Cleaners to get my dad's uniform pressed before he came home on leave. She didn't have enough money to pay. But Mrs. Thompson just smiled and said, 'Tell your father, welcome home for me.'" The crowd listened in silence. Years later, when I graduated high school, I received a scholarship, the Sarah Thompson Silent Hero Scholarship. It paid for my education, but more than that, it taught me the power of small acts of kindness. Today, I'm a Marine because of her, and I know I'm not the only one. Some of my fellow officers are here today because of Mrs. Thompson. She may not be with us anymore, but her kindness still lives on. As Daniel stepped down from the stage, a wave of applause filled the hall. Sarah's name, spoken with reverence, was still shaping lives long after she had gone. Back in Oak Ridge, Thompson Service and Cleaners remained open. Though Sarah was no longer there to press uniforms, Jessica Thompson, now a decorated Marine officer, had taken over the shop. Veterans still gathered there, sharing stories and keeping Sarah's spirit alive. On the walls, a new photograph had been added, a framed letter from the President of the United States, officially recognizing Sarah's contributions to the nation. One quiet afternoon, Jessica found herself speaking to a young boy who had wandered in with his mother. "Is it true?" the boy asked. "Did she really just say thank you to soldiers and it changed the world?" Jessica smiled. "Yes," she said, "and you can do the same. Sometimes the smallest kindness can become the biggest miracle." The boy thought for a moment, then nodded. As he left the shop, he paused to hold the door open for an elderly man. It was a small gesture, a simple act of kindness. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces of the world, Sarah Thompson's legacy continued, one small kindness at a time. Years passed, and Sarah Thompson remained a symbol of quiet kindness. Her dry cleaning shop, Thompson Service and Cleaners, became more than a business. It was a haven. Veterans, young recruits, and even strangers passing through Oak Ridge stopped by, not just to drop off uniforms, but to share their stories, seek advice, or simply sit with Sarah over a cup of coffee. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah received an unexpected letter in the mail. It bore an official seal, one she recognized instantly. With slightly trembling fingers, she opened it. "Dear Mrs. Thompson, for years I have heard your name spoken with reverence among those who serve. Your story has been passed from one barracks to another, inspiring soldiers who have never even met you. I was one of them. I first learned of you when I was a young cadet at West Point. Our instructor, a decorated general, told us about the woman who pressed uniforms and left handwritten notes of encouragement. He said that while medals and commendations were honorable, it was people like you who gave soldiers the strength to continue. Now, years later, I find myself in a position to do something I hope will make you proud. It is my honor to inform you that the Robert and Sarah Thompson Center for Military Families will be built next year near Arlington. dedicated to providing support, resources, and community for the families of those who serve. Your kindness has echoed across generations, and this is just a small way to ensure that echo never fades. With deepest respect, General William Carter, United States Army. Sarah sat in stunned silence, the letter resting in her lap. Her heart swelled with an emotion too big to name. Bob's name, her name, etched into history in a way she had never imagined. Later that evening, as she closed the shop, Sarah looked up at the photo of Bob on the wall. She traced the edges of his Marine uniform with her fingertips. "You were right, Bob," she whispered with a smile. "The small things always matter the most." The silent hero's legacy continues. Years passed, and Sarah Thompson remained a symbol of quiet kindness. Her dry cleaning shop, Thompson Service and Cleaners, became more than a business. It was a haven. Veterans, young recruits, and even strangers passing through Oak Ridge stopped by, not just to drop off uniforms, but to share their stories, seek advice, or simply sit with Sarah over a cup of coffee. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah received an unexpected letter in the mail. It bore an official seal, one she recognized instantly. With slightly trembling fingers, she opened it. "Dear Mrs. Thompson, for years I have heard your name spoken with reverence among those who serve. Your story has been passed from one barracks to another, inspiring soldiers who have never even met you. I was one of them. I first learned of you when I was a young cadet at West Point. Our instructor, a decorated general, told us about the woman who pressed uniforms and left handwritten notes of encouragement. He said that while medals and commendations were honorable, it was people like you who gave soldiers the strength to continue. Now, years later, I find myself in a position to do something I hope will make you proud. It is my honor to inform you that the Robert and Sarah Thompson Center for Military Families will be built next year near Arlington, dedicated to providing support, resources, and community for the families of those who serve. Your kindness has echoed across generations, and this is just a small way to ensure that echo never fades. With deepest respect, General William Carter, United States Army. Sarah sat in stunned silence, the letter resting in her lap. Her heart swelled with an emotion too big to name. Bob's name, her name, etched into history in a way she had never imagined. Later that evening, as she closed the shop, Sarah looked up at the photo of Bob on the wall. She traced the edges of his Marine uniform with her fingertips. "You were right, Bob," she whispered with a smile. "The small things always matter the most." A new chapter begins. Months later, Sarah stood at the grand opening of the Robert and Sarah Thompson Center for Military Families. Hundreds of people had gathered, including veterans, active service members, families, and government officials. But Sarah hardly noticed the cameras, the speeches, or the flashing lights. What truly moved her were the young soldiers who lined up to shake her hand, their eyes filled with gratitude. One young woman, barely in her 20s, approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Thompson," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you. My father served in the Navy, and he used to tell me about your notes. He said they reminded him why he kept going. When he passed away last year, I found one of your notes folded in his old uniform. It was the last thing he ever kept from his service days." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. She took the young woman's hands in hers. "What did it say?" she asked gently. The woman smiled. "It said, 'Your service matters, but so does your heart. Thank you for both.'" Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had written thousands of notes over the years, but hearing this, knowing just one had stayed with someone so long, made it all worth it. From that day on, Sarah's legacy became more than a story whispered among soldiers. It became a movement. Schools across the country began incorporating the Silent Hero Pledge, encouraging students to commit small acts of kindness. Years later, when Sarah finally retired at 80, she did so knowing that her work would never truly end, because as long as one soldier carried a thank you note in their pocket, as long as one child learned that even the smallest kindness could change a life, Sarah Thompson would never be forgotten. As the years passed, Sarah Thompson's story continued to inspire. The Robert and Sarah Thompson Center for Military Families thrived, providing comfort, resources, and support to those who served and their loved ones. Veterans who had once felt forgotten now had a place to belong, a space where they were heard and honored, not just for their sacrifices, but for their stories, their struggles, and their quiet moments of courage. Sarah remained active in her community, visiting schools to speak about kindness and service. She never saw herself as extraordinary, just a woman who believed in the power of small actions. Yet, her story traveled further than she ever imagined. Military academies taught new recruits about her unwavering spirit, and students across the country learned about the impact of a simple thank you. On a peaceful evening, just days before her 85th birthday, Sarah sat by her window, watching the golden sunset settle over Oak Ridge. She held a well-worn note in her hands, one she had written for Bob decades ago, tucked into the pocket of his uniform before his final deployment. The ink had faded, but the words remained. No matter where you go, you are loved. No matter what happens, you are never alone. With a deep, contented breath, Sarah closed her eyes, feeling at peace. She had lived a life of gratitude, a life of purpose. And in the end, she had proven what Bob had always told her. The smallest things often matter the most. What about you? What small act of kindness have you experienced that left a lasting impact on your life? Have you ever done something simple, like a kind word or a helping hand, that turned out to mean more than you expected? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in the power of kindness, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Every week, we bring you true stories of ordinary people making an extraordinary difference, because sometimes the quietest heroes change the world in ways we can't even imagine.